Welcome back, friends, to Understudied. We are so excited to be here with you. We are the Women's Health Podcast from McGee, and we want to thank our sponsors, Genentech. Genentech is focused on improving healthcare and conditions that exclusively, differently, and disproportionately impact women. And that's what we talk about here. We talk about what is understudied and what is underfunded as far as women's health research is concerned. And of course, what McGee is doing to make the change. And everyone can be a part of the movement to push progress in women's health forward, which is why we're doing this podcast and which is why we appreciate you so much hanging around, listening, learning. I know I do every single time that I sit down with anyone from McGee Women's Research Institute. We hope the same for you at home. So thank you for listening and being a part of this conversation. Now, last episode with Dr. Toll, we talked about why women have been understudied in medicine. Go back, check out episode 1 if you didn't already listen. I think it was the perfect foundation for our future conversations, and we are only excited to add to our girl gang today and introduce to the conversation the Executive Scientific Director of McGee Women's Research Institute, Dr. Pam Moali. Thank you so much for being here. We were so excited to have you join us today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. And, you know, not only do I oversee the entire research institute, but I'm also a clinician. So I'm a clinician and a scientist. And like Corley, I am a urogynecologist. And what strikes me the most is when I tell a patient, for example, ma'am, you have pelvic organ prolapse. And she says, well, what is that? And I can describe what it is. But when she says, why?
Yes.
Why did I get this? I have to say, well, we don't really know. But then I can go on and say to her, but in my lab at McGee Women's Research Institute, we're studying women who are high risk for a maternal birth injury that we think predisposes to this later in life, and recruiting women into this study so that we can understand what happens at the time of a traumatic birth so that we can repair it then and so that she's not going to suffer later in life. And then she's like very, very excited about this, but I have to tell her, unfortunately, we don't know a lot about women's diseases. Right. And so your interest, please follow us at the Research Institute, please get involved. And they get really excited. And that in turn excites me.
Absolutely. And I think that your position is unique, being that you are a scientific researcher and you're at the bedside. And I just think that there's so many different I think there's a lot of people who have gone into a women's health appointment, whether they be vulnerable, whether they're scared, they don't know what's happening, and they're trying to get these questions answered. And a lot of the time, they're met with not faces that don't want to help, but again, that's a whole different, side of the business. So the fact that you get to be at the bedside while also being in these labs and being the middleman, you would say, to these two very important aspects of women's health research, is that unique in your industry?
Very unique.
Yes, like you're the only?
So I was fortunate enough when I became interested in research in college. I went to Brown University, and very unusually, I had a MD, PhD research advisor. And what she said to me is that you can be the most amazing clinician in the world, but you're never going to advance health unless you do research. And so she started me on a path of wanting to become a physician scientist. So I went to Northwestern and got an MD and PhD, and my PhD at that time was in oncology. Oncology is very big. Obviously, we need to know a lot about cancer. But when I was talking to the patients, especially the female patients, and they had brain fog, or they had palpitations, or they had vaginal dryness, the answer was constantly, we don't know why. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, maybe I should go into something that I could be front facing with women. I can normalize conversations about their bodies, and OBGYN seemed like the perfect place for me to, apply to. Well, little did I know that my advisors were like, do not do that. You will never succeed as a scientist. It is not academic. Women's health is just not where it is. But I did it anyway. And the reason, as an MD, PhD, we really can pick our residencies of choice. So even though I looked at Harvard and UCSF and all the top programs, when I came to Pittsburgh and I saw that the Department of OBGYN had its own independent research institute, I was like, and this is in the late 1990s, this is amazing. This is how we're going to move women's health forward. And I went to a conference there, and they didn't even use the word he. It was all she, she. And this was mind blowing to me, coming from Northwestern, and so. Yeah, so I decided to come to McGee, and actually I've been here ever since,
Perfect.
mainly because of the Research Institute. Yeah.
I love that. Take that, Harvard. That's all I'm saying. We got one up on you. And Corley, you were with me in episode 1. The conversations that we had obviously gave us the basis on what you guys do. But I kind of want to go back to why McGee? Because I think that, myself included, until I started working with Women Who Rock and some of the benefit, or knowing that you guys were the beneficiary to what they did, and then I got my own personal interest, having had children, having have had any kind of different medical issue. As women, I feel like we're just perfectly born with just a few, just sprinkled in there that we have to bring up. Yeah. I think a lot of people would be shocked to know that McGee is not just the hospital and one of the best, I would say, in the country for bringing babies earthside, but that there's a whole different aspect to you guys. So why do you think, what exactly is the Research Institute? Let's start there.
So yeah, and I do think, even myself, like Dr. Mwali, when I came to interview at McGee, didn't fully understand that it's literally right across the street. Yep. So if you've ever been to McGee's ER, right across the street is the Research Institute. It is very unique as far as to have a women's hospital that's kind of freestanding on its own. And obviously McGee does more than that, but to have kind of a place that's really centered on the clinical side of women's healthcare, but then to so closely associated, have an entire institute dedicated just to women's health research is completely unique. And I think trainees who visit and everyone else who comes even for their careers, it's a really unique relationship and a really nice spotlight and support system. There is so much support that kind of goes back and forth. And Dr. Mwali, she mentioned she's an MD, PhD. I think it's important to also kind of point out that physician scientists and physician MDs who also have PhDs are unique amongst most of the doctors you know. Most doctors you think about do not have that extra training, myself included. And so it's a really significant and important career choice that then opens up a lot of opportunities, like being able to say no to Harvard.
Right. Again,
yes.
sorry, we have her. We got her first.
But it opens up a lot of unique opportunities, and it means a career that looks a little bit different than what you might kind of typically think of associated with a clinician. And it's really unique in women's healthcare, as Dr. Mwali points out. Luckily, she had the gumption to kind of keep saying yes, and we are lucky to have a lot of physician scientists that, I say a lot to me from my perspective, because within the division I know so many, but we are lucky that McGee has recruited and has a lot of talent within it that are both clinicians who work at the bedside and then also work directly at MWRI. And it's such a unique perspective to talk with patients face to face at the time of that vulnerable appointment that's bringing them in, and to really hear about what's affecting them, and then to translate that into the next question, the next project, the next, research study is really unique. And to have all of that again at McGee, I sometimes say that anytime I exit McGee, even to go to other hospitals within Pittsburgh or beyond, I sort of forget about how the culture is there, because it's so focused on women's health, and it seems so natural to us to be focused on these questions. And then you kind of take one step out into reality and you realize that that's not always the case, that it's harder to sometimes move the needle than you think, or that it's really just not a priority everywhere. So it is a really unique thing. But I think probably the thing that people probably don't really understand is that physically they're right next to each other. We really should build a bridge. I know we've talked about that we talked about that for a long time.
$1 million. I've looked into it.
Yes, it costs a lot of money as anything, as any construction in Oakland does. However, there always seems to be construction in Oakland. So
true.
But it takes literally 2 minutes, and a lot of your doctors who you see at McGee are also working there. And some of them have their own labs, like Dr. Mwali, and some work in collaboration with people who are running labs there to answer their questions. Then some there's also different types of research, which we could get into kind of later. But a lot of the McGee Research Institute research focuses both on clinical and on bench, which kind of looks more at the deeper, the original question of why this happens, the original understanding on a cellular level why prolapse happens. That's part of what Dr. Morali looks at.
Okay.
So yes, so they are two institutions that are very, very close neighbors, and a very symbiotic relationship is kind of explains the Research Institute. And not every doctor is a researcher, kind of would be the other point.
But the way the DNA of McGee is, every doctor becomes a researcher, because even if you're in front of a patient and identifying an unmet clinical need, there's a ear across the street that you can ask the question, and that will be translated into a research project. So that's the singular unifying theme, right? That you can ask a question and that there's going to be somebody who's going to help you answer that.
And I think it's because as a woman who was born at McGee, I ended up not having my children there, and that was simply because of proximity to myself in Oakland. Yeah. But it is the Cadillac of birthing hospitals.
And the Porsche.
Oh, definitely the Porsche. Yeah, you're right. Actually, you're right. Exactly. And whenever I think of it, I always thought that prior to knowing that the Research Institute was right next door. So now knowing that there is just a whole different chapter, it's like you may leave the hospital with your baby and go on to live a beautiful, happy life, and we so hope you do. But you may have left a couple questions with your doctors, and those questions right across the street, quite literally, you're looking once, twice, and walking into their front door. It's hopefully going to get answered. It might not be tomorrow, it could be in years, but there could be a family down the road that is learning from the cases that are there as we speak, which I love learning. But what I kind of want to go into the problems that you're trying to find resolutions for, because I know that we can say women's health care all we want, but as we know, women are very complex beings inside and out. And I would love to know, what are you guys tackling that no one else is, that you decided that, this can be handled under this roof? We have the capability in both, your facilities and in your clinicians.
Well, one of the things that makes us unique in terms of pregnancy in the immediate perinatal period is our maternal, obstetric, and infant database. Okay, so women will come in their first trimester, they give blood and urine, and each visit throughout their pregnancy, we continue to collect blood and urine. And then when they deliver, we not only photograph closely their placenta, but we also biopsy it, because we know many pregnancy problems are related to the placenta. And then if their baby has a problem, the baby is followed throughout its course in the NICU. And now we have the technology to link, so that database, which started in the early 1990s, some of the people are now in their 50s and 60s, and we're linking it to the databases of the broader university. So now if that person goes in to have cardiovascular disease treated, or some sort of cancer, or chronic pancreatitis, we now can go back and say, well, what about the environment of the pregnancy may have led to this later in life? So that's a huge thing. We also are in Pittsburgh. We're an obstetric center, but around us, like just 30 miles away, we go into OB deserts. So we're learning to monitor women remotely. When is it important to come into the hospital? We can monitor you for contractions and blood pressure. So our remote monitoring is way more sophisticated than other places. But beyond pregnancy, we're very interested in understanding endometriosis. Women see an average of 10 to 12 doctors before, but instead of just having a single scientist trying to investigate endometriosis, we've partnered with engineers so that we can use AI and machine learning to understand what clinical variables harbinger that this woman has endometriosis, because the only way to diagnose it now is by surgery. We're trying to prevent that, diagnose it earlier. And then we have another group of scientists who are trying to understand why it predisposes to clear cell cancer of the ovary later in life, right? So the full spectrum of endometriosis. We're interested in ovarian aging. We now understand that the function of the ovary is so important for a woman's not only lifespan, but her health span. So that the earlier the ovary senesces, or a woman experiences menopause, the more likely she is to experience cardiovascular disease and neurovascular problems like dementia, bone-related illnesses. And so we're trying to not only understand how the ovary, in terms of preserving it so that it's fertile, in women during the normal reproductive ages, but that it remains active later in life, not so that you can have babies, but that it can keep you healthy, right? Without increasing your risk for these diseases.
That's unbelievable because you know that the ovary obviously is the more or less the heartbeat to a woman outside of her heart. Like that is many things happen from. It is the stem of everything. But, now I'm getting into, I have friends that are, 40, mid 40s who are talking about I think I'm past perimenopause. I think I'm hitting menopause. And I also think that is such a confusing conversation too, because also perimenopause symptoms, they sound like pregnancy. They sound like you're about to just start your periods. And I'm like, this is all very confusing. Don't you wish it was?
It could be completely random, joint pain, random,
bladder,
skin changes, things and we don't even, that's even the surface of it. We don't even fully understand.
Yeah, and this is all very new, right? So when I was in training, we were taught to take the ovaries out of anybody over 40 to prevent ovarian cancer. And then I started personally noticing that these women were suffering and that they were, we were putting them on hormone therapies and stuff to kind of get them over this sort of surgically induced menopause. And then, I started transitioning myself into, well, we never remove the testicles of men, right? And every time I bring that up to a patient, well, do we ever remove testicles? They always laugh, but that sounds ridiculous, right? But
it's the wall crazy.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound ridiculous to remove a woman's ovaries, right? Because it's a culture that we've developed. So now our practice is to kind of keep them in as long as they look okay. Do we risk that they may get ovarian cancer down the line? Yes, but when we look at ovaries and they look like they're in a very healthy environment, we're pretty sure that person's not going to get ovarian cancer down the line, and that we can save a lot of women whatever they're offering them for a lifetime.
Absolutely. And again, I have had friends who had their ovaries removed probably too early, and they're realizing that too, who are now going to be on hormone replacement therapy for the rest of their life. And it is really just amazing that you don't realize that until your orbit starts changing around you. And it really is true how, we aren't exactly told that there's a research institute in Oakland. We hope that all of these smart people are obviously just going to save the day and save all of us at the end of the day. And when I say we, I mean me personally. I feel better knowing that we have this amazing medical community in Pittsburgh, because it is just so unique. But I also think that we don't know a lot of these issues even will arise until they start happening to a friend or your mom, or you don't look into these. Thank God you all are quite, just silently behind the closed doors.
Yeah. And yes, there have been a lot of new concepts. I think that, like we talked about even in the last episode, things that are different from when I started my medical training to now. The whole concept that the ovary is not just an egg and baby maker, but it actually can have complex immune functions and functions on all of these other systems, including cardiovascular and your bone health. And that's part of the question that needs to be asked. What does removing these really mean? What is their function even beyond menopause? Is there a function?
Yes,
to kind of understand the ramifications of what's been standard of care, and if that should be challenged, which I think is an important part of healthcare and research at all times, is to kind of constantly be reevaluating. Just because it's always been done, why? And have we noticed anything different with how that has been? Which I think is also, like Dr. Morale pointed out, with understanding a woman's health care during that 9-month period of their pregnancy, and what does that show us about the beyond. I don't think we really even thought of, certainly decades ago, we weren't thinking about that. And McGee really had a lot of foresight to start developing that database, because you can't really, some of these answers take decades. And so we only have that because we have some of these specimens from the 90s. And you can't really know how someone's menopause or hypertension is going to develop if you didn't really collect some of that stuff while they were pregnant.
I think what you're referring to also is that we're in this unique environment, right? So I think women don't really know that you may go to an OBGYN and this is no fault of their own, who may be sort of in a community practice, right? Where you're basically, working not necessarily in an environment where it's much harder to keep up, right? So if you're in an intellectually stimulating environment and people are asking questions back and forth, it elevates the level of care automatically, right? Because like if somebody said, "Did you read that paper that showed?" And I'm like, "Oh, geez, I didn't read that paper." And then I'll, read the paper. Yeah. So, so it also helps us keep up on evidence, and evidence that's not necessarily isolated to our field. We get into these, broader questions. Our patients come in with pelvic floor disorders, but because most of them are aging and most of them are menopausal, certainly not all of them, we now really are interested in the function of the ovary.
For 50 years, Genentech has pursued groundbreaking science to discover and develop innovative medicines for people facing serious and life-threatening diseases. Genentech is also focused on improving healthcare in conditions that exclusively, differently, and disproportionately impact women.
And I think it's just refreshing to know that there are constantly people pushing back and just saying like, well, I realize that that's the answer, but it's just not good enough for us. So we're going to ask 10 follow-ups and we're going to get the answers to all 10 follow-ups. And I mean, I think that's a great segue into Pittsburgh becoming this medical research powerhouse. And I mean, the OG who asked the questions, Jonas Salk, I mean, I want to know why Pittsburgh truly for all of this to be happening, and how blessed are we that it's happening in our backyard. But I think that not a lot would associate us with being this medical mecca.
Yeah.
And I mean, why do you think that it kind of has become from the ground up?
Well, I certainly didn't know it was a medical mecca until I started applying and realizing it. And yeah, Pittsburghers are just nice, kind, humble people. And I think that carries into the medical community as well. People who come in from the outside and see us caring for our patients say, wow, you really care about your patients. And we're like, yeah, well, that's kind of the culture that we have here. But we also have a culture of innovation. Like Jonas Salk, seeing, thousands of children dying of polio, said there's got to be a way to mount their immunity to fight this, and sort of figured out a way to inactivate the polio virus, gave it to children, and then saved millions because it came adopted worldwide, and now polio is really unheard of, right? And similarly, we had Thomas Starzl, who was recruited here in the 80s. He had figured out how to transplant a liver into a patient, or a portion of a liver, and have it function as a full liver. And then, he wanted to be somewhere, he came from Colorado, and he wanted to be somewhere where he could just do research. Like he could focus on research. He didn't have to be an administrator or as much focusing on surgery. And so Pittsburgh set that up for him. And not only did he learn, perfect the liver transplant, but he developed immunosuppressants. So the things that allowed us to tolerate having another person's organ in us were developed by and perfected by Thomas Starzl. And then he went on to develop kidney transplants, pancreatic transplants, and multi-organ transplants. So having that culture of innovation, seeing a problem, having the passion to solve it, I think really is founded at the University of Pittsburgh. It's in the culture. It's why, our current dean is very focused on innovation. He's a very big innovator himself. And so that naturally, is going to translate into women's health as well.
Absolutely. And having different spans of careers, Dr. Corley, what do you do? Your friends that are clinicians, like I'm thinking about my friends who I would sit around, a table with and be hanging out with. Is this the environment that is everywhere? Because I feel as though the asking questions, being a younger woman in the field, asking questions, constantly pushing back, I feel as though sometimes in certain places it could, be frowned upon.
Yes, I think so. I obviously have friends who are clinicians and physicians and women's health physicians, even outside of Pittsburgh and beyond. And certainly there are a lot of academic powerhouses across the country, and thank goodness for that, because we need them. But I do think the specific research support that McGee has is somewhat unique. And I even tell this to new trainees who are starting. I'm like, there's so much opportunity. You can sneeze and a door will open. It's really unique to be able to be so supported and to have so many. A lot of the research that I have done in my career has found me, has been, oh, yes, I have this question, or I happened to be at the table when a conversation happened, and that's how I got incorporated. I mean, that's kind of, I always kind of joke, I'm just here because Dr. Wiley just kept keeping me, and that's what,
Kept talking and you responded.
And I met her as a second-year resident. I was like, oh, wow, she's an amazing surgeon. I'll just follow her forever, and that's kind of why I'm here. But so I think that is what's really unique, is just that there can be opportunities just really facilitated, and that is incredibly unique, because a lot of times, and even I have a new intern mentor who I was talking with, kind of describing this, talking about her career goals and what she wanted to do, and I was like, you will be able to do all of that. I was like, everything you think of, you will be able to do that. There's everyone here, you need to do that. This isn't somewhere you're going to have to grind and really seek things out and really have to take a lot of, not that you don't have to try. Everyone has to try.
Yeah, of course.
And she goes, oh, well, where I came from, yes, I just did not have as much opportunity. I was having to, even to get to match at a program like here, was having to work really hard to find all my research. And I was like, yes, that chapter of your life has ended. Welcome to McGee.
You've reached the light.
You've got
at the end of the tunnel.
And I was like, but with that does kind of come some responsibility. There's a lot that you can do. And so I do think that there's a big culture of, then there's a lot that you should do. We should take advantage of this opportunity and these resources. But yes, so I think, like we talked about earlier, like so much of what can happen, some of the really great projects that I've been a part of and all of the amazing work that Dr. Wiley has done, it can be really organic how a new question comes up. And to see it go from question to an actuality it's crazy that you could even see that within like a short span of my career. I have not been doing this quite as long as Dr. Wiley, but I think that's really exciting. So yes, there's innovation across the country. I think the amount of resources being so focused on women's health is truly unique here. And it lowers the threshold for being able to put things into action.
Right, because when the culture is established as one that is opened in someone who, passed up Harvard to be with us, thank God. And then there could be someone else who is very new into the industry. I think that there's something really refreshing about everyone's opinion mattering the same, and everyone's questions about life and being able to push back on it. Because I know there are many industries, and especially in the medical field, it's usually, well, this is the answer.
Yeah.
And that's it. And I hope you have a great day. We'll see you in 6 months at your checkup. And that is just not the case or the culture here.
Yeah. Well, two things. First, operating with Coralie when she was a second-year resident was an incredible privilege for me, because the reason she's here and the reason she keeps getting picked is she has this incredible hunger to get better. And like, she's the only person I would be on call with, and they'd be, there's a woman in the, ED with a hemoglobin of 4. I would think she's like, yes, we can do this. We can do this. We've already done 3 surgeries that night, and so, yeah, she's got I think that's who we attract to this. And then the second thing I wanted to say is that when you're in that bubble, though, it seems like the rest of the world is too. So I always thought, being here, that everybody was interested in women's health, and that surely, everybody was trying to answer these questions. And it wasn't until I started going into leadership positions that I realized that, wow, women are really undervalued by our society and by health systems, because it's not a money-making field at all, so the fact that we have a female CEO, we have female leaders who can advocate for the importance of keeping women healthy is really, really an important narrative that we have to continue to promote.
And I'm so happy, just that you mentioned that it is not a money-making field, because in conversations that I've had with, not just at McGee, just in general, just clinicians around Pittsburgh, and I've mentioned, my passion for what you all do, and they've said, like, that is a passion field. Like, every single person in women's medical research, they're not in it to buy their 10th Ferrari.
Yes.
They're in it because they truly do want to better the lives of women after them that come out with the research that they do. There's such also a respect for the medical the women's medical care, all of the research that you all do and the care that you all give every single day, because I think so much so now more than ever, we're reading just constant negative headlines about the medical industry, and we're all being pushed these narratives on it's just about the underlying, it's just about the money that's being made, and it is so refreshing for people outside of your industry to know that the people underneath your roof are there simply for the betterment of their community members, for women who could be across the world. And I also think that's so important to mention, that the research and everything that is done here in Pittsburgh is sent all around the world. So let's talk about that and how the research that's done at McGee Women's Research Institute really does affect everyone. And it doesn't just stay here in Pittsburgh.
Well, and I think something important to kind of also point out, like we talked about with research, if we're kind of, two things. You're totally right. It's a hard time. It's healthcare's been hard for a long time.
Very, it has.
But it feels like a particularly hard time, especially for women's healthcare too, because I want to shout out to patients who have helped drive some of these questions, because I do think things like social media and even media in general putting new light on this. A lot of questions even about pelvic pain and endometriosis have been driven by kind of public outcry over this. And with that also comes, there's been a breakdown in trust, I think, on some level. And that's part of what we hope to do here, is to kind of bring some humanization back to what goes on, not just this theoretical, test tubes and lab coats and goggles in a far away place, but to kind of understand how it actually works and how it actually is happening. Because that would be our goal. These answers are only as good as the patient's trust in us. If they're not going to believe what we have to say or trust that we're telling them something from the truth, or that we're not there for a Ferrari, then a lot of it doesn't matter. So I think that that's really important. And then the other part of that too is about how does health research reach out to the masses and even beyond McGee. Part of that is that some of the studies we do, research takes numbers. It takes collecting data for decades sometimes, or it takes, spreading that out geographically. So some of the studies that happen at the Research Institute, we are a part of like a larger network that are all collecting together. For example, there's a question right now about how much aspirin in pregnancy is the right amount to help prevent some of these placental problems that we deal with, like preeclampsia and hypertension in pregnancy. And part of that has been answered across the globe, but we need to understand it in our population of America. And so we are a part of a larger cohort right now trying to answer that question, enrolling for that study as it speaks. So that's one example of how sometimes we are a part of a network of other collaborators who are all recruiting. And that's good for two reasons, because each state is not the same, and each population that each hospital treats is not the same. So we want diversity of population. And then we share our data with them, they share ours with us, and we get a better bottom line from when we do research that way.
Yeah, and we also have surgical networks, right? So we have the Pelvic Floor Disorders Network, where we, compare different surgeries, look at outcomes, look at predisposition to failure of surgery. We've looked at anal sphincter injury, through that network. We belong to multiple networks, but another way that we really disseminate our information is we make sure that we all attend national meetings. And I now go outside my specialty, because when we go to the specialty meeting that Coralie and I belong to, so the American Urogynecologic Society, so many of the talks are by McGee people. I'm like, I know this, I know this. Yeah. Okay. So, but you can go outside your specialty. For example, I was, I guess 6 years ago in a surgery where a young girl was born without her pelvic organs. So she had no vagina, no uterus. And it happens when it's common. And there's a pretty painful procedure that they can go through for dilation, but it's, for young girls, it's pretty painful. So we were in the surgery, and the plastic surgeon was taking a piece of her thigh so that we could make a vagina. He goes, the vagina is so simple. We just fold it into a tube and then it's fine. I was like,
excuse me? We are complex from the inside out.
So I said, well, if we can make livers and kidneys, we certainly from the bottom up can make a vagina. So I set about saying, okay, well, let me look in the literature and what is known about vaginal, native scaffolds and vaginal stem cells. Nothing. And I was like, okay, well, I know my next project. So we were able to start identifying vaginal stem cells. We developed a native vaginal bioscaffold, but the stem cell was, getting them, verifying them, showing their stem cells was very expensive. And we were able to apply for what we call the McGee Prize. And the Mellon family gives every so often $1 million to a lab to develop a new novel idea that's so cutting edge, it's not likely to get funded by normal mechanisms. Sure. So they funded that project, and now we're going on to get federal funding and expanding it and understanding what happens to these stem cell populations so that we can keep at a very organic level the vagina healthy over the lifespan and ultimately to translate into biofabrication.
Unbelievable. And that's all it takes. It takes that one surgery, that one person, that one clinician to be
one comment angering you, and then you
that's it. Let those comments fuel your fire and change your life and the medical industry. And I just, the more that I speak to both of you and from our first episode and everyone that you work with, it is just such an empowering culture. Because again, not only about the medical industry and the trust and the things that we're constantly fed every day, it's that women are pitted against each other, and we are only as we have to climb on top of another woman. We can't both open the door and walk through together. And it is just so empowering to hear a big group of women, or just maybe one woman in the correct room to hear that one thing to say, that's not going to fly here. And it's not going to fly. And since there is no rule book to follow, we'll just write it ourselves. And I think that there's something very Pittsburgh about that approach too, which I love. We often often write our own rules. But I really love, and I want to touch on before we wrap up, how women's health is across the lifespan, because often people hear women's health, and they've probably heard it a million times so far today on this episode. Many people immediately think pregnancy, because that's what women do best, and or breast cancer. And that's only a very, very small part of our story, I would say. So let's move through the life stages and where you guys can really step in, starting with babies and girls.
Well, like Dr. Morale commented on, she had an example of one congenital anomaly where lack of pelvic organs at birth, but there is a whole spectrum of different congenital anomalies that can affect babies and girls, and that can kind of move through. And then as you get into adolescence, we've also touched on endometriosis, heavy periods that also affect their ability to participate in sports, school, life.
No one knows why. No one knows the origin of heavy periods.
Yeah.
No one even knows what defines a heavy period. So we're really
because it's all different for every woman.
Because nobody's ever bothered.
And you like,
it's like,
it's like,
why?
I think if you say heavy period, everyone can imagine. Well, I guess I'm speaking to mostly people who have periods, but everyone can imagine their version of a heavy period, but it can feel so individual. But yes, objectively quantifying it can be really difficult. Yeah. So another hole, and which holes
I actually have an interesting story related to that. We had a conference on AI in women's health, and it was actually kind of cool because we brought in legislators, local legislators and state legislators who make rules regarding AI and, talking about how it needs to be regulated, important things. But it was really interesting because one of the legislators who is happens to be, his name is Richard Fitzgerald. He's one of my partner's dads, and he has how many girls? 8? Seven girls and one boy.
No, 2 boys. 6 girls.
Okay, so he has 6 girls.
Yeah.
It's a big family.
Right. And I guess one of the legislators brought to their attention these period deserts where there's no menstrual products, and products are very, very expensive, and some young girls who are in college couldn't afford them. And he was like, I had no idea this was a thing, and I was like, well, if you didn't know that was a thing, like how do you know about pelvic floor disorders or obstetric emergencies or anything like that? He's like, you have to come and tell us. So it really made me think that as a researcher, as a women's health advocate, we do have to get out of our offices, our jobs a little bit, and go speak to other people about the problems that face women. Because if we don't even know about heavy vaginal bleeding, the problem with having expensive products to use during menstruation, to be comfortable and not to deny yourself so you can pay your rent. It's just amazing, like how primitive we are in a way.
How a man with 6 girls didn't,
No,
because
but he said that. He
didn't
brought
ask
it
the
up
question.
to his credit.
Sure.
He was like, this is amazing. I need to know more.
Absolutely. And how we truly probably do just need to talk about it more.
But I interrupted you. You were going
Well,
across.
I mean, but that's also, same thing. You say heavy periods, not everyone can define it. You also can say heavy periods, adolescence, and you don't think school or economic burden,
right.
which actually it is. And, so these.
Completely.
But this is exactly what conversations like this and conversations at conferences are important, and they kind of highlight problems, and problems mean questions, and questions mean research, and then hopefully answers and solutions.
Absolutely. And I really want to go back to how you said that you had met Dr. Moali, your second-year resident, and how you were talking to one of your interns, mentees, and how that is obviously a crucial part of your business. It's also one in media as well. I have had many mentors. I still do. I work with them here in this building. Every time a younger student, as I'm sure for both of you, wants to talk about radio and media and just getting into it, I'm like, yes, sit down. Do you have time? Should we go to Starbucks? Actually, let's get dinner. Like, I have so much to tell you, and it fills my heart and my cup. And how important that is specifically in your industry is building kind of tomorrow's researchers, tomorrow's clinicians. So I think about the audience who's listening right now, who's listening not only because they are looking at both of you and thinking that you're living their dream and you're doing the work that they want to do one day, because I can imagine that there definitely are. I mean, there's at least a couple watching right now, so interested in what you're talking about as I am. But why do you think that McGee is one of the differentiators? What makes them unique in welcoming that new generation? Because I think that I know that this could be an industry that probably is a little intimidating to get into.
I mean, all of it can be intimidating. I think probably part of the thing to focus on is just how many opportunities there are to be involved either in women's healthcare or in research. I mean, Dr. Moali, for example. Dr. Moali runs a lab at McGee Research Institute, which we talked about, which is unique. Not all clinician scientists have their own lab. But how many people are in your lab, and what are the various levels and roles that they all fill?
Yeah, so there's multiple entry points into women's health, and I actually have this conversation a lot with young people who are an undergrad at Pitt. So we got a lot of undergraduates in the lab.
Okay.
They get credit for coming into a lab, and so they get to rotate 20 hours a week or so, and to kind of learn about the problem. And but then they just decide, well, do I want to do research? Do I want to go to medical school? You get a lot who want to go to medical school because very forward-thinking. In order to get into medical school, you have to do research. And I think that the ultimate idea is to get clinicians a little more research-oriented, at least thinking about the problems. Or you could do both, I say to them. And, it's exceedingly difficult to get into medical school. It is really something that you have to decide early on in your undergraduate education, and be willing to give up your 20s and 30s to the hospital. What, for us was an extremely exciting time because you're learning your trade, your craft, and so it goes by very quickly, but that's not for everyone, right? And so research it's also very difficult to get into a university of, Pittsburgh School of Medicine graduate program, but you can get in, and then you can do research, and then get your PhD, and then eventually a postdoc, and you can decide to go into industry, which is another important component of advancing women's health, because there's a lot of new companies that focus on women's health. Or you could run a lab and be an academician. So there's multiple ways to kind of contribute and elevate women's health.
And then that's so nice to hear, because I think that it is just another reminder that there's enough room at the table for everyone.
Yes,
there really is. And if
more.
You are right. The table's real big, and we have a lot of questions that need answered. So if you are watching this right now with any interest, please, please, please make sure that you get in touch with the McGee Women's Research Institute. Ladies, thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
What an awesome episode.
Yeah.
I have a lot of my questions answered, but don't worry, we will always have more on the next episode of Understudied. Thank you again to our sponsor, Genentech. So excited to have them on board. They are focused on improving healthcare and conditions that exclusively, differently, and disproportionately impact women. And we'll see you next time.